themes the new pluralism of the museum collections, access, and inspired use of the assets at hand. He likened the function of the museum representing all the muses to the agora in ancient Greece, a place of ideas, dialogue, exchange, discussion, and challenge. The Art Museum and the Department of Art and Archaeology, placed in the heart of the campus, an axis mundi. Of course, in the embarrassment of riches that we all enjoy in Princeton, it is possible to know of and admire someone for a lengthy period before ever actually meeting. This is true in the case of my meeting just at the end of last week for the first time, Professor Jerome Silvergill. I collect 15th and 16th century Southeast Asian ceramics and Indonesian bronzes, and we both count as friends many of the same scholars in the constellation of Asian art studies. One of the great luminaries in this constellation is our speaker this evening. Jerome Silvergill is the P.Y. and Kenmei W. Tong Professor of Chinese Art History at Princeton University and Director of Princeton's Tong Center for East Asian Art. His teaching and publications are in the area of traditional and contemporary Chinese painting, Chinese gardens and architecture, and Chinese cinema. In his teaching and in his more than 50 publications, he has dealt with such topics as artistic tradition in times of political upheaval, the aesthetics of old age, perception and misperceptions of historic change, bad art, and the articulation of the negative, the relationship between architecture and paintings of architecture, regional diversity in Chinese gardens, and visual communication in a culture of political censorship. Among his recent books, articles, and exhibition catalogs are Hitchcock with the Chinese Face, Changing Views of Change, the Songyuan transition in Chinese painting histories, Outside In, Contemporary Chinese American Art, China, Seen by the Chinese, Documentary Photography, 1951 to 2003, all receding together, 100 slanting lines, replication, variation, and some fundamental problems in the study of Chinese paintings of architecture. Photography goes to the movies on the boundaries of cinematography, photography, and videography. The political animal, metaphoric rebellion in Charles Gong's 14th century painting of Heavenly Horses. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Jerome Silvergill, who will offer a very enlightening evening. And Jerome has agreed to a Q&A session following his talk. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you, John, for a very generous introduction, and Mark for getting us through this. I'm always technology-based, and I have no technical skills, so I'm always lucky if I'm able to deliver a lecture. I thought there might be 5 or 10 people here tonight, so I'm glad that you're all present for the occasion. And let me give you just a brief background to how I came to do this, because this was a project that was unanticipated. It's one of 2 chapters that I ended up contributing to a book that Blackwell's is bringing out on their companion to Chinese cinema, and I was asked to do one that related film to the traditional arts of China. And that's another long story that I won't go into. But when I saw the table of contents, which includes about 32 of us who write about Chinese cinema, mapping out the different approaches that we take, I noted that there was not a chapter on film music. We all know how important film music is. And so I said to the editor, you got to do this. And he said, well, nobody does this. And I said, well, I know somebody who could. He said, well, I don't like him. So I said, well, you know more about Chinese cinema than most of the rest of us put together. You do it. And he said, well, I'll think about that. Then on May the 1st of this year, which was just about the day that classes ended, I wrote him an email note. And I said, how's that music chapter going? And he said, it's not. And I said, well, what about it? And he said, well, forget it. This is May the 1st, and everything is due in on May the 5th. So I said, without looking at my watch, what if I give you a chapter in 3 days? Will you read it? And I had an edited chapter back on May the 5th. So that's the product, not of having really thought about this subject before in a direct way, but just having bounced off of it time and again in my regular teaching, because you can't think about cinema without having somehow to think about the various things that make it go, and music makes the movies go around. And I'm using this partly as an excuse, because this is in no way a definitive study of Chinese film music. It's what happened to come together when I took bits and pieces of things that I had happened to thought about and said, well, how do I fit these together in some kind of a pattern that tells a story? It's not the story, it is a story, and I suppose that one could go back and write several different kinds of stories. But follow me on this one, and it is designed not to be definitive, not to be a historical survey, but it does have a historical dimension to it. In fact, it has a very long historical dimension to it that covers 3,000 years, and you'll see what I mean by that once I get reading. And I am going to read this, which I apologize for in advance, because I would never at Princeton read a lecture to my students, or I'd be booed out of the classroom. So here we go. Few filmgoers fail to recognize the tug that movie music has on them, setting the mood, warning or surprising them, cueing them as to how they might interpret a scene or a character. Much has been written about Western film music by those who turn film's images and music into words. Hardly a word has been written in the West about Chinese film music. I would like to talk about this subject. And yet, in doing so, I would like to adopt the position taken by Oberlin professor Xiujuang Deptman in her study on the adaptations of literature to the screen, to the effect that any overarching theory is perhaps impossible, and at any rate, less useful than unique, detailed analyses that each artistic case affords. She writes, and this is a long quote, "Since different combinations of factors can become decisive in almost every individual case of adaptation, I think it is a mistake to try to decide the matter in advance. I believe, a fortiori, that because one cannot fix criteria in a general hierarchy, no abstract science for the study of Chinese adaptation is ever likely to form. And so I have adopted in this book an approach that is responsive, descriptive, and ex post facto, rather than predictive, prescriptive, or a priori." And I do the same. Still, there is one overarching judgment that I would like to make of Chinese film music at the outset, namely, that while music refers both to melody and to lyrics, and while both have considerable importance, it is the use of lyrics that I believe is most distinctive about Chinese cinema. And this to such a degree that I might say most serious Chinese films, at least before the current decade, could loosely be considered to be musicals. Generalizations other than this, and especially generalization intended to characterize any single distinctive application of melody as Chinese, stereotypically meaning slow-paced and contemplative themes for solo instruments, deteriorate before the endless diversity generated over a century of Chinese film production by drawing upon Chinese operatic, folk, and classical music sources, by the various sources of traditional and modern Chinese and Western styles, sometimes mixed together beyond recognition, and by complex interactions between diegetic, which means sounds heard by those characters within the film, and non-diegetic or exegetic uses of sound and music, meaning background music heard only by the audience. Made when sound was still new to Chinese film, and what I call genreification, the division of subjects and themes into films according to different subjects and themes, had not yet set in. The film Street Angel, which you're looking at a frame of here, directed by Yuan Muzhi in the year 1937, easily blended vaudeville and music, romance and politics, low comedy and high tragedy, all into one movie. A variety show bursts upon the opening scene with a battle of the bands, with Western and Taoist musicians performing at the same time on the streets of Shanghai in a cacophony representing the chaos of China in the midst of changing times. The musicians are part of a wedding march for a cross-eyed bride. And who wouldn't go cross-eyed trying to focus on this musical intersection? The male protagonist of the film, a trumpet player in the Western marching band, catches a glimpse of the bride, and he himself goes cross-eyed on the spot. And that's our first clip. That's our star, the very thing. Get the spit out of that horn. There's the other band. And here comes the bride. Cross-eyed people. His girlfriend, who we see here, is all smiles at first, and she's a musician as well. But the audience is soon shown beneath that smile a stepdaughter who was purchased by her parents as a virtual slave for what she can bring in as a cabaret singer, always paired and compared throughout the film with her older sister, who is sent out to perform tricks as a street prostitute. The actress, Zhou Xuan, seen here, who performed this famed role, rose from it to become the most famous Chinese singer of her generation, much like Edith Piaf, and equally tragic at the end. Here, the film slips easily from the weighty spoken narrative regarding the older sister into the musical language of dreams. That's the mother. And the older sister has just returned from a night on the streets. And there's the younger sister with her songbird, who's going to start this song for us. Songbird. And there, living right across this narrow alley, is our trumpet player, the boyfriend, China's most famous actor. vaudevillian stuff. Pay attention to the lyrics. Sister has to listen to all of this, feeling not a little jealous. That's the father who doesn't want any part of this. I think the bird is thoroughly enjoying it. That's a long clip, but a very important one, and you'll see why. The thrust of the film's narrative was for the boyfriend to come to grips with the older sister's prostitution, for which he despises her throughout most of the film. But when she sacrifices her life at the end to help the young couple flee from the grip of the heartless parents, he recognizes at last that the sin of prostitution was not that of the sister, but of the corrupt society which had thrust this fate upon her. Street Angel clarified and conjoined the professions of musical performance, acting, and prostitution, as they really were conjoined throughout most of Chinese history, and much of European history as well into the 20th century, both in the public imagination and in fact. Later films, Chinese films, featuring music and opera and prostitution, like The Street Players and Farewell My Concubine, continued to explore this conjunction. Lust, Caution, directed by Ang Lee in the year 2007, which reconstructs the time and the place of Street Angel from a different social and narrative vantage point, makes direct contact with the earlier film in a critical scene in Shanghai's wartime red light district, where the female protagonist sings Zhou Xuan's signature song from Street Angel, The Wandering Songstress, which you just heard, which has a lingering fame in China, much like that of the song As Time Goes By from Casablanca. In Lust, Caution, the singer is a seductress and a would-be assassin, targeting a collaborationist master spy for the Japanese. And her song occurs at the very point at which the two adversaries acknowledge the prostitute-like roles that each of them have adopted. She in bed with him, he in bed with the Japanese. The girl is like a thread, Joe Schramm sings in the original, to her boyfriend's accompaniment on the erhu. The boy is a needle. Strung together, they will never part. In Lust Caution, the two are strung together by their enmity. Two spies, each trying to penetrate the other, until one or the other is crushed. And for the young singer, actress, spy, in Lust Caution, who significantly sings unaccompanied, this is a moment when lowering her guard to feel genuine affection for her rival helps to seal her fate. Typically, song appears as an occasional interlude in Chinese film, as the expression of emotion that erupts when necessary, and like the Greek chorus, serves to guide the audience toward the meaning of the narrative in progress. This is an age-old tradition in Chinese culture, emotionally directed, yet allegorical in form and rhetorically indirect, going back to the combination of folk songs and court paeans anthologized in the Shirting, the classic of poetry, or the Book of Songs, or the Book of Odes, depending on how you translate that title, dating back to the 9th or 8th centuries BCE, and reputedly edited by Confucius himself. The classic expression of this idea is given in the great preface to the Book of Odes, which reads, "When emotions are stirred within, they are given form as speech. When speaking about them is inadequate, then they are sighed as laments. When sighing them as laments is inadequate, then they are chanted as songs. Emotions are given sound, and when sounds are combined into compositions, these are called musical modes. The musical mode when the world is well ordered is tranquil, expressing pleasure, for the government is harmonious. The musical mode when the world is chaotic is resentful, expressing anger, for the government then is wicked. The musical mode when the state is in ruins is mournful, expressing contemplation, for then the people are in distress." All that remain today of these 300 classic songs are the lyrics, China's oldest poetry, and none of the original melodies. In the film Third Sister Liu from 1961, the authentic songstress of that name, who was born in the year 705, takes on a proto-communist identity for the occasion, and in her initial appearance, she voices the rationale for the people's music, singing, "Whatever sentiment in the mind suppressed erupts like fire in songs from the breast. Mountain songs are like springs so clear, sung in valleys and jungles everywhere. They rush and roar like floods unfurled, breaking all dikes and inundating the world. If songs are not sung, sorrow will spread. The beauty of this opening scene lies in the film's matching of these lyrics, like floral fragrance at the foot of the mountains and so forth, with cinematic imagery, one for one, as well as in the fine musical performance. The persecuted songstress makes it clear that when the people are oppressed, the music of the people will erupt in revolutionary song. And in the course of her music, she reveals the risks of singing too openly. This is a little difficult to read, so try it. Here's the audience, the young hero and the old wise man. What we learn from films like Yellow Earth, 1984, which ushered in the modern era of Chinese cinema, which we'll see more of later on, is how the government, today as long ago, will monitor popular songs to see how well it is faring among the people, as a kind of polling process, and then will manipulate the results to convince the people that the party and the people are all doing quite well. Thank you. It takes the words right out of their mouths and gives them back new ones. Professor Han Saucy has written of the conversion of folk songs to Confucian allegory, saying, "Poetry tattles on society, a society formed in part by the canons of its poetry. The work of art, it seems, gets lost and found between its two functions of documenting mores and changing them." Unquote. Many of the earliest Chinese-made films were staged performances, beginning with Dingjun Mountain in 1905, from a section of the Beijing Opera. The model, or Yangban films of the Cultural Revolution, revived that tradition. Unlike most later Chinese films, The White-Haired Girl, filmed in 1972, is a full-fledged musical. Jiangqing, or Madame Mao Zedong's revolutionary balletic version of the traditional opera, staged during her reign as China's cultural czar in the Cultural Revolution. In it, the dancers do not speak or sing, but perform to the accompaniment of background music, as in a silent film. At this peak of China's determination to chart its own course, to go modern at a revolutionary pace, and overtake both the Soviet Union and America on its own terms, one might have expected something particularly nationalistic from a model film like this, something closely derived from Chinese opera and distinctively Chinese. But the music and dance seen and heard here are a mixture of East and West, which proved particularly challenging in the isolationist phase of this Maoist era. The story of persecution and class conflict, of a peasant girl sold to her impoverished father's landlord as a slave and sexually assaulted by him, then escaping to the mountains, reaches its pitch when she returns home, with her hair turned prematurely white, to gain her revenge in a peasant uprising. The landlord and his accountant are hauled off stage to be executed by the white-haired girl's boyfriend, because it is a man's job after all. And 2 shots ring out, beats from an orchestral drum, to announce the completion of the deed. This leads to a communist-style celebration, then a hallelujah chorus, danced by a somewhat Doris Day-like heroine, to the tune of Prokofiev-style Russian motherland music, followed by a quasi-Tchaikovsky-esque Waltz of the Flowers, and concluded by Mao Zedong coming up over the hills in the form of a red rising sun. There's the landlord and his accountant. There's the boyfriend. You can tell him, boyfriend's always got a gun. All right. Long live Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao. This goes on for about 3 hours. I use it as an example to teach, well, to explain why I didn't used to teach Chinese film. Of this high Maoist style, Harold Schoenberg, the New York Times music critic, wrote in October 1973, quote, "To westernize the ballet is anything but revolutionary. It is a naive, innocent propaganda fairy tale, primarily stemming from the Russian ballet, saturated with the dance vocabulary of the West. Once in a while, Chinese elements are introduced, native instruments, the pentatonic scale, and even a few microtones, but most Western listeners would classify the score of the white-haired girl as movie music. Certainly, all of the cliches are there," which tells you what he thinks about movie music. Schoenberg actually was writing from Shanghai about the live theatrical version of this, famously attended by President Richard Nixon and the First Lady, in the company of Jiang Qing. But what he heard, nevertheless, was movie music, undistinguished, cliched, tawdry stuff. As for the white-haired girl dance troupe, he wrote in 1973, again, that they were rehearsed to a point where they could bear comparison with the Rockettes. It's all a little bit like ketchup on scrambled eggs, so of course Richard Nixon liked it. Despite Jiang Qing's pretensions, the real revolution in Chinese cinema still lay ahead. Yellow Earth, directed by Chen Kaige in 1984, which is often considered a turning point in Chinese film history, was originally conceived by its author, Ke Lan, as a musical paean to the government and to the people, to be set in a well-watered and flowery valley with no reference to North China's parched and unyielding yellow earth. But the filmmakers, including musical composer Zhao Jiping, overhauled Kalan's work step by step, and the songs became fewer and more sober each step of the way, like the film itself. The film's title followed a similar progress, evolving from Kalan's romantic Echo in the Deep Valley to Silent is the Ancient Plain, and finally to its present title, Yellow Earth. Set in 1938, the story features an 8th Army soldier who gathers peasant tunes, that old polling process that I mentioned before, and rewrites them to have them sung as communist propaganda, a gentle form of ideological re-education. Yet the bitterness of the peasants' tunes seems gradually to penetrate the soldier's naive self-assurance. At a wedding near the beginning of the film, where the newlywed couple is too poor to afford the usual auspicious servings of fish for the guests, in order to avoid its absence, they serve up reusable wooden fish laden with sauce, as the hired wedding singer chants in the local North Shanxi Xintianyou style. Quote, pairs of ivory chopsticks are set out on the table. The sieved wine from the silver pot is poured with a golden ladle. Of course, it is not. This is all sung as if lyric fantasy could somehow replace reality, and maybe for some people it can. But one of the unconvinced guests informs the song gatherer, he just sings bitter songs. Songwriter going to write it down. Although Yellow Earth, looking back in time to the impoverished rural landscape in place, leaned heavily upon folk traditions for its music, it helped to open the door to a new and more liberated era in filmmaking, especially in what is regarded today as art films. Army Nurse, from just the same time, 1985, defined itself by focusing on a single pivotal scene. And that scene was defined musically by a creative interplay between diegetic sound and non-diegetic music. The narrative features a young woman packed off as a youth during the Cultural Revolution to serve at a remote military hospital. As the years go by, she grows up there, deprived of a normal childhood, of a private or romantic life, and wedded instead to her work. At one point, however, she is attracted to a handsome young soldier, a relationship forbidden to her, which leads her to refuse him at first any medical attention when his bandages need changing. But then she relents, and for one brief moment, just about 10 seconds only, she expresses her need and her longing by resting her head on his shoulder. It is the only love moment in the film, and the only one in her life. And for all her years of pent-up and suppressed desire, these few seconds must suffice. One can hardly imagine that film director Hume, a female herself, would not have given particular attention to the film music accompanying this brief instant, just as she has to the striking, medium, and tight close-up shots of the couple. And the musical solution was innovative for its time. In this scene, a nearby repairman, seen earlier than this clip, is hammering away at a broken window, while outside an army bugle blows. Both of these diegetic sounds become part of the non-diegetic music as the young nurse yields to her personal longings, but then reverts quickly back to the military discipline expected of her. The hammering, combined with, and then transferred to percussive cellos, becomes the dramatic but threatening heartbeat of her desire. The call of a bugle, now internalized, draws her to her soldier, but also back to the duty that disrupts her desire from becoming fulfilled. Then, massed rising strings express a romantic longing and dissolve into quavering notes, while a rising arpeggio of plucked harp strings appears as if wakening from a dream. The audience may be left uncertain about just when these diegetic sounds ceased to be quite real, and instead became part of her developing, but ultimately undeveloped fantasy, in her own brief period of disrepair. I previously historicized this scene, writing of it, quote, "Their physical encounter is so brief and so chaste, it would scarcely qualify as a sexual encounter in America. But initiated by a girl, narrated by a woman, and representing a whole culture, so starved for personal affection, after 10 paranoid years of destroying all internal enemies, the brief 10 seconds when Army nurse touches military patient became one of the most emotionally charged moments in modern Chinese cinema." You can hear a little bit of that tapping on the glass still.
你怎么才来啊？哎呀，对不起对不起，突然来了个老乡，他老婆难产，快要让你耽误了。没事吧，小乔？
啊，没什么。
好了，我来。
Occasionally, the understanding of the film, or part of it, turns on an understanding of music. And in the West, our understanding of Chinese folk music often falls short. The Day the Sun Turned Cold, directed by Yim Ho, 1994, involves a family father who is being cuckolded by his wife and who may, perhaps, later be murdered by her and her lover. The son, who you see here, claims to have been a circumstantial witness to this, but is he to be believed, or is he acting out a childhood fantasy? The melodic accompaniment for this film is appropriately tragic, kind of bittersweet Schubertian chamber music without lyrics, that reflects the son's love-hate relationship with his parents. Slow, dolorous, modulating between major and minor in mood. This classicizing music, kept to the background for the most part, serves its purpose well, even in this rural setting where the villagers would never have heard such Western music. And the composer modulates it well also, low, slow, and grim at the worst of times, sweeter for nostalgic moments like this one, galloping along with the jingle of horse bells while sleighing through the snow, the mother with her new acquaintance, who's soon going to be her lover. Mother and son, hot sweet potatoes on a cold day. This is China's great film actress, the Meryl Streep of China, said. Sweet potatoes. The father's a stern Confucian teacher who never laughs. You can see why she's drawn to the young man. That was all a flashback to better times. Now he's with the police officer who he's making the claim that Mom killed Pop. No less interesting in this movie is a wordless folk tune that leaps into the foreground, diegetic, but brief and perhaps all but unnoticed by most viewer listeners. As the father is first coming to realize his predicament, he finds himself in public practicing music with the villagers, rehearsing for a village celebration. Fellow townsmen who have come to recognize the father's problem before he did, and who are now gossiping behind his back. At this moment, the wife and lover are secretly trysting at the family home, and the father has his suspicions. Surrounded by his fellow musicians, the father plays a brief tune of his own, a folk tune of some kind, on the wailing double-reed swana, while the camera zooms in slowly into a tight close-up of his sadly frowning face. The others listen, and one of them asks, "Mr. Guan, what was that tune?" And the father replies, "What was that tune indeed?"
关先生不是我愿跟我闲事儿，我看不得吧，老往你家去。这村里人闲话可多了。
啊，那是我让他去的。
关先生，你吹的是啥曲牌啊？
是，我吹的这叫啥曲牌？哎，
他都不跳了，打鼓、打耍呢。
Immediately afterward, the father takes a performance break, dashing home, purportedly to get new reeds for his instrument, but mostly to surprise his wife there and confirm his suspicions. She's been busy with the woodcutter, indeed, but he fails to arrive in time to catch her. And yet the villagers' question remains unanswered. They don't know the tune, and neither do we. This could go unnoticed, or it could raise a lingering curiosity. What does it tell us about what the father knows, or thinks he knows, or thinks? Is it a tune of cuckoldry, of submission, or revenge? Is it a clue to the father's recognizing his fate? What folk tune or opera might it have come from? Or did the filmmakers just make it up? I have yet to meet any ethnomusicologist who can identify this tune. Increasingly, in recent decades, and this will be the last example, as Chinese film music becomes ever more westernized, Western classical music has been used not only to establish mood melodically, but also to reference lyrical content and context that enrich the films in which they appear. Western classics play an understated but telling role in E.E., Edward Young's film of the year 2000, a study of generational patterns and the predictable phases of life. A particularly poignant moment in the film occurs at a concert performance of Beethoven's First Sonata for piano and cello, attended by the adolescent daughter, Ting Ting, of the film's protagonist family, during her first experiment in dating. As the two musical instruments first spend a little while agreeing on the key they're going to play in, and then join together in sonority in the languid, romantic opening measures of Beethoven's second movement, the music raises the question of whether the young, awkward couple will join hands or even become a real couple. What the audience will perhaps recognize is how the young man is simply dating Ting Ting in order to arouse the jealousy of his longtime girlfriend, Li Li, Ting Ting's next-door neighbor, and a cellist herself. The filmmaker cueing the audience by this substitution of the cellist on stage for the cellist it already knows. Ting Ting's thinking about and stealing glances at him, whilst he's watching one cello player and thinking about another. Ting Ting can hardly be oblivious to this, but cannot resist being drawn in deeper and deeper into the boy's own troubles. The boy, ultimately, will murder Li Li's lecherous teacher, who has been sleeping with Li Li's mother, and perhaps with Li Li as well. The structure of the duet on stage mirrors that of the scene, and of the film as a whole, beginning tentatively, followed by gentle pairings, and then becoming less and less lyrical, ever more complicated. Watch her, watch him. What the film audience most likely does not recognize is that the musicians on stage are being played by director Edward Yang at the piano and his wife, Peng Kai Lee, an accomplished professional musician who recorded the piano music that Yang is supposedly performing and accompanied him on the cello, which means accompanying herself, actually. For a film about role exchange, because what's going on with the daughter is exactly what happened to the father 30 years ago, these transferred identities constitute a kind of filmmaker's inside joke, a play within their own play, entirely consistent with the nature of the film. Yang's own family was very much a part of this film about families, lodged there especially in his wife's music. Peng composed and performed much of the film's background music, including its opening theme. I don't want to tell you what it is. Maybe I'll let you guess. It's a variation on something we all know. Like the other piece, it started finding its center, and then it takes off.
姐啊，最近现在推荐你跟铁子啊，
啥呀？以后靠你自己在撑的。现在是不知道我在家的。哎，对。小安，小朋友们，小安。
Mark got it right off, did you? Beethoven's Ode to Joy, inverted. And it's a wonderful film. I recommend it most highly to you. That little boy steals the show, won the equivalent of Academy Award for it at age 6. It's just amazing. Peng composed and performed much of this film's background music, including its opening theme, beginning by setting the key as Beethoven's cello sonata, but with a melody drawn from Beethoven's Ode to Joy chorus, and converted to a tender ode to the unchangeable past, played Andante cantabile. The title itself, Yi, or 1-1, is the Chinese equivalent of the 1 and a 2, with which the Western band leader begins a performance. It also stands for the way in which the film's family of 4 each goes off in their own way, one by one, to grasp the deeper meaning of their lives, only to return at the end, like Dorothy back to Kansas, with the realization that the meaning was there all along, lodged within the family. While music appears infrequently in EE, as often diegetic as not, nearly every presentation of it in the film merits deeper inspection. Early in the film, Ting Ting's father runs into his childhood sweetheart after 30 years apart, and when he departs from the family to examine things, he reunites with her in Japan to relive his past and ponder how his life might have been had he not broken off their engagement. Soon after meeting her again, there is a moment when he climbs into his car with a prospective Japanese business partner, Mr. Ota, whom you see on the left, father on the right, whom he has just met and who will become something of a muse to him throughout the later course of the film. As the father turns on the car engine, the music system offers up Bellini's famous song, Vacaluna che in argenti, wandering moon which dapples with silver. And Ota surprises him by whistling the melody, which initiates a nostalgic conversation in broken English about music, and with a prefiguration of the reunion that will take place between father and ex-lover in Japan, just when his daughter is at the concert on that first date.
The great Leonard.
Ah, you know music very well.
When I was a little boy, my family was very poor. Music make me believe life is beautiful.
My father listens to music every day, but I hate his music.
So?
When I was 15, I fell in love. Suddenly, all of his music means something. Then she left. The music stayed with me.
She didn't like music.
Many people think that music is useless. You cannot get any money from listening to music. She also thinks it's weird.
So she left you.
No. I decided to leave. But, you know, I just met her a few days ago. After 30 years.
This must be her music. I can almost see her face, man.
You know music well.
Father doesn't speak Japanese, Ota doesn't speak Chinese, so they're speaking this rather broken English. Part of it goes. My father listened to music every day, but I hated his music. When I was 15, I fell in love. Suddenly, all of his music means something. Then she left, but the music stays with me. And then Ota pronounces, this must be her music. I can almost see her face now. Music here has become the mood, the characters, the present situation, and the future plot, all in one. And while the film's characters can hear the music, it has become much more than that which can be heard. How well can the Chinese audience hear and understand this heightened level of musical engagement? And how well can we? I would like to say in conclusion, and in place of any summary or theorization, that what matters most is that music has now entered Chinese language film at this level, where it can work in great sophistication at all levels, where it can express at least as much, and perhaps even more, than most in the audience can grasp. Chinese film music no longer springs from revolutionary necessity, but arises from global exchange. On a map, Beijing, Shanghai, and Taipei are closer to Schubert's Vienna and Bellini's Italy than they are to Hollywood. Although today such distances hardly matter. The influence of Western music, Western film, Chinese music, and Chinese film now flow rapidly in all directions, and their musical interaction offers more sophistication for the years to come in film production and audience education the whole world over. Thank you.
I think we have time for a couple of minutes, a couple of questions for Arnie.
During the Cultural Revolution, would it have been that form
Ooh, really bad form. Or to put early Chinese music, if it was not folk music. Classical Chinese music was as out as anything else. So things were very limited, very constrained. What you could and couldn't do was very narrow. Any other questions? Let me just say before, unless anybody wants to go, please go. We kept you waiting just to get started. That if you want to see the list of movies that I use for my cinema class, you could go to the university website. From there to the Tang Center, T-A-N-G Center. And from there, within the Tang Center website, movies. And I give you the chart of the, I think, 23 Chinese films that I use in my film class this semester. And I can guarantee you they're all good. And almost all of them have something musical of significance going on. Other questions? There was one or two. Mark, you had a question?
Beyond the area of music in the film of Chinese films, is there a dynamic music life in popular music going on, or is it becoming more westernized in China?
By popular music, do you mean Lady Gaga equivalent, or
What people are
pop
listening
music?
to on their
Absolutely,
iPods?
absolutely. It's a wild scene, and it is a challenge to the government to keep up with it. It's a very sophisticated, popular challenge to the current administration. It's very sad. Well, if there are no more questions, it's out into the rain, but thank you.
Thank you very much.
John.